I came across him, I think it was 4.5 years ago, and I ran across one of his presentations on YouTube. And I was blown away because I didn't know who Jarret Walker was at the time. And so I've never heard anyone speak on transit as clearly is him. And I didn't know about his book at the time, but here it is, Human Transit, how clear thinking in public transit can enrich our communities and our lives. He took normally you'd hear people talking about transit who are engineers or just planners from the perspective of this is how we do it, and it's not very exciting stuff. And he made it real because he attached it to the human experience. How can we view this as not just transit, but this is an extension of how do we live our lives, how can we make our lives better by getting from point A to point B. So ever since that time, I immediately recruited him to say, hey, when I was with Placemakers, I said, can you come do a webinar for us? Please do a webinar. Other people have to hear this. And I was impressed then, and since that time, he's come to the Congress for New Urbanism. I brought Carly Almlabar, our Chief Development Officer from Lafayette, Louisiana, to the Congress this year, and I said, you really should go hear Jarret, because I know you were really struggling with transit issues. And she said, okay, let's go listen. And then she was blown away. And so anyhow, without further ado, Jarret Walker.
Thank you very much, Nathan. I believe everyone in this business knows that Andres Duany is the hardest act to follow in the entire business. I do have a few comparably controversial things to say, though, maybe even some things he might want to disagree with. We'll see what we can do. So yes, I've been designing public transit networks for about 23 years, and the book is here. The Twitter ID, if you're tweeting, is Human Transit, and I do have a few copies of the book here if you want one. So a few things that we probably all know by now. Everything about urban transportation is changing. Our highway departments ran for almost half a century in the confidence that the volume of driving would always go up. And about a decade ago, it stopped going up. It turned flat. And it's been relatively flat ever since. This is happening in most comparable countries, too, where I work, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, and so on. And we've got a lot of different emerging new reasons for people to try transit and for people to think about transit differently. It's not just, of course, the millennials flooding back into the inner cities. It's also a new concern with affordability because our financial circumstances are somewhat different than we may be used to. New concerns about safety, vision zero, the sense that our tolerance for being slaughtered in the course of transportation is going down, and that our tolerance for a certain death toll is declining. There's some sort of shift in values about that. But we can't, I keep coming back to how the value of travel time has been transformed by this. Those of you who remember not having this, remember back then when you didn't have this? We didn't know back then how boring driving is. Because we didn't have anything else we could do with that time, right? But now we drive with that thing on the seat next to us, and we're supposed to watch the back of the car in front of us and this guy's stupid bumper stickers, and we're supposed to watch expanses of asphalt and white lines and look in the mirrors at other cars while fascinating things are buzzing at us right over here, and we're not supposed to look at it. It's excruciating. I am one of those type A personalities who could always be doing something, and the reason I will take a bus if it takes twice as long as driving is that I can use the time. That, and I don't personally like to be responsible for not killing lots of innocent people in the way that every driver is. So, the attitudes that prevail in your communities right now about who uses transit are probably going to be increasingly wrong. And you're going to have a choice as civic leaders about whether you want to be out in front of and helping people see how those attitudes are changing, or whether you want to be in a reactionary position. So One of the reasons I need a little bit of time this morning is that I don't just have to explain transit, I also have to unexplain what people think transit is. And here are, in my experience, the three most common false assumptions about transit that prevail in the United States. And I want to say right away, these are completely understandable because most of us are motorists, and many of us in this room are also involved with development, built environment, architecture. And as if you come to transit without consciously remembering that these things are different, you'll get these things wrong. And we'll see this theme coming back several times in my talk. So I found my way into the CNU and was honored to speak at the last CNU conference, partly because I made a bit of a nuisance of myself over this first issue. It's very common in the urban design professions now to hear transit described as infrastructure and as part of the built environment, and of course it is. However, one of the reasons that early new urbanists were not very effective at getting transit agencies to do what they wanted them to do was that they didn't all understand what a transit agency's job is. And a transit agency's job is to watch an operating budget. Transit is operations. That is to say, the cost of transit is overwhelmingly the cost of the driver, the cost of keeping the vehicles moving, keeping the thing going. And so one of the things you'll notice that's often a discontinuity about the way we talk about transit infrastructure in this country is you'll hear people talk about the transit infrastructure as though it has some sort of direct outcome. We built this rail line and this development occurred, right? But if you unpack that, what has to actually be happening is you built this rail line so that you could run this rail service. The rail service made it possible for people to get from this place to a lot of other places. Therefore, this place had value. Therefore, development occurred, right? The actual logic is via the operations. And my friends in the built environment professions are often skipping that step, but it's a very important step not to skip, because if your infrastructure doesn't permit highly efficient operations, it ultimately doesn't matter. Second, the notion that is very common in this country that transit can be targeted to populations and markets of interest. I think this is coming from really the fundamental starting point of most businesses who start with a market segmentation analysis, and what a market segmentation analysis does is divide the population into our potential customers and not our potential customers. And then you start wanting to focus on these people. So one of the things I want you to notice in this talk is that one of the absolutely perverse and revolutionary things about public transit is that it succeeds best when it's planned for the maximum diversity of ridership. That is, to get as many different kinds of, to be useful to as many different kinds of people as possible at the same time. We don't focus on diversity in the transit business because we're complying with civil rights requirements. We do it because it's the mathematical basis of our success. It's actually the geometric basis of how we succeed. And finally, we'll tend to assume when starting about transit that we want to talk about a route or a line or a project. I want to convey to you instead that actual successful transit is about networks, and networks are made of connections. The joints are as important as the links in creating an actual functioning network. So what exactly is a transit system? So I want to show you a little animation. Each of these dots is a transit vehicle. This happens to be a typical day in Vancouver, British Columbia. So you've seen a whole bunch of dots appear as the thing ramps up, right? And one of the things that's going on here, the two pointers are pointing you to two special places of interest. But let me just pause and notice one thing right away. Our product is a whole bunch of events. The event of a vehicle operating along this path, therefore coming by all of these stops or stations. My job as a network designer, and the reason that network design is an actual profession and an actual craft and something you want to hire someone who knows something about, the task of organizing all of these events, designing the pattern of these events so that they collectively become a useful thing. Because what we actually want, what our actual transport desires lead to, and the road is a beautiful metaphor for these desires. We want to go now. We want a thing that will take us there now. And that's what a road is if you have a car or a bicycle, and that can be a wonderful thing. But in transit, that's difficult, and we actually have to work at it because our product is actually an event, a vehicle coming. So how do we turn that event into a thing, something that feels, you want me to use that?
Yeah, if you want to walk around.
Sorry. How do we turn the event into a thing, something that feels like a road, feels like it's there whenever you want to go? The answer is frequency. And so what you'll see happening here is you see Vancouver's transit system getting into its morning and then its midday condition, is that you're starting to see solid lines appearing, right? Now the solid lines that are appearing, like the one that the far left arrow is pointing to, those lines actually are nothing but a bunch of events. But the events happen so frequently that the pedestrian's experience there is that you walk out on that street and it's coming anytime soon. So frequency is the thing that is what turns the event of a transit vehicle coming into an effect like a road, an effect that it's ready to go whenever you are. Frequency is really fundamental. The other thing I want you to observe is what the other arrow is pointing to, which is that you'll see if you look at that at the right-hand arrow, what it's pointing to, you'll see places where dots come into the center and then burst out all at once. They come in and burst out. They come in and burst out. When we can't afford frequency, we do something called pulse scheduling, which is we time all of these infrequent buses to be there at the same time. So they all sit together so people can connect, and then they all leave. They come in and burst out. It's called a pulse. And this is why we sometimes need rather large transit center facilities that are hard to fit into your community, but there's a reason we need those. It is a function of low frequency, by the way, which means one of the alternatives to having a 12-bus transit center is getting your community to assemble the operating funds necessary so you can run more frequently, because the more frequently we run, the less we need to do that. What we're constantly trying to figure out how to do, of course, is first of all, we have to build a line out of a bunch of events. And then second, we've got to make the lines connect with each other so that we're useful for going places that aren't on the same line that you're starting on. That's what connections are about. Why are we doing all this? Now, your conversation about transit is going to be dominated by a lot of people who want something in particular. They want they want to get more customers to this location. The tourists want people to have a tourism experience. There is a civil rights perspective on this, where we have to make sure that we're being inclusive of everyone, regardless of various demographic categories. And it's hard to focus on what it is that we're actually trying to do in a way that can excite people. And I have finally come upon this as, I think, really the key. So this is a little tool called an isochrone. And what this little tool does is you pluck your pointer down, and it shows you from that place where you could be in 15, 30, 45 minutes. Those are the three colors. Blue is 15, green is 30, and pink is 45. Shows you where you could be on transit plus walking, where you could be. This is a powerful way to analyze a transit system in terms of what we call its abundance of access, which is another way of describing liberty. Where can I be soon? Now, one of the cool things about this is you can move your pointer around, and as you move your pointer around, you discover the opportunity to take responsibility for the consequences of your own location choice. This is a colossal issue in transit. Honestly, this sounds ridiculous, but it happens. Employers move from a tower downtown out to a business park on a cul-de-sac, and then they call the transit agency and say, "What happened to our transit service?" No, it sounds funny. It actually happens. There is a fundamental refusal in our business communities to take responsibility for the consequences of our own location choices. And this is the most conservative idea in the world, which is that you get to locate wherever you want, and your choice has consequences, and you get to live with those consequences, and it's not necessarily the job of the public sector to bail you out of the consequences of your choice. If you chose to live to move your business to a business park, you chose a car-based commuting system, and you chose that experience for your employees, and there's not very much we can do about it given the way your business park is built. So fundamentally, I can move my pointer around. I'm looking at getting a new office space in Portland right now. I can look at, this is Portland, Oregon, my hometown. I can look at if I choose to spend the extra money to put my office downtown, here's where employees will be able to get to me. Or if I go out into a sort of mid-hipster inner city district, there's where they can get to me. Or if I want to be in a leafy business park, there's where they can get to me readily, and I can take responsibility for the consequences of my location choice. This tool needs to be attached to every real estate listing, because both your home location and the decisions employers make, oh, and by the way, the decisions that the Social Security Administration makes when, like, they look for the cheapest possible land on which to build their office, and the cheapest possible land is a place that the transit agency will have to create a new bus route to serve because it's out on the wrong end of a business park, and there's quite logically no transit anywhere near it. But the other thing about abundant access is that when people start looking at these blobs, they see, wait a minute, okay, so the point of a better transit plan is for these blobs to be bigger, to expand my liberty and opportunity. Because if you think about liberty and opportunity, transportation is just fundamental to it. And when we present it this way, we're no longer having a desiccated engineering conversation about delta travel time. We're having a conversation about expanding people's liberty and opportunity. And that gives us a different and more compelling reason to do great and efficient network design. So fun, and of course, we're not just talking about the area of these blobs, that would be mobility. We're talking about access, which is the amount of useful stuff in these blobs. And really, what we're talking about is how much of the city in all its richness is available to me, which really goes to the fundamental reason why you would live in a city in the first place. Because if you live in some of the places I've lived, in big cities where transit is so terrible that you basically can't get much of anywhere other than where you can walk to, then you really might as well live in a small town, because you don't actually have access. You can't actually use your city. So abundant access means as many people as possible, able to reach as many destinations as possible, as quickly as possible, but not just for that reason. Lots of people react badly to that word quickly, okay? I know we've got people here from New Orleans. I understand that speed and haste are not really part of the New Orleans brand, right? The brand is about slow and easy and relaxed. But you know what? Here's why. So that they have as many real choices and opportunities in their lives as possible and are therefore free. So there's something very transhistorical, very universal about this notion of abundant access, and the reason it does require a degree of haste. Not necessarily that we want we want everyone to be stressed out rushing around all the time, but there's still a limit to how much you want to slow things down, and that fundamentally lies in our desire that people have access to opportunity, and a faster, more effective service gives you a larger range of opportunity. It gives you access to more jobs, it gives you access to more places you can go socially. If you're using public transit, those blobs determine the range of people where you could meet a potential partner. This is pretty fundamental stuff in terms of how it guides your life. It's not a hypothetical, by the way. I know of couples who've actually broken up because of transportation problems. It's an actual limitation. So one of the other things we have to strip away that our engineering friends and that a lot of the sort of infrastructure analysis world brings to this is this notion that it's all about ridership prediction. Yes, ridership is an outcome that transit agencies really value, but our ability to predict ridership is in continuous decline, and it should be completely obvious why. Ridership prediction requires that we assume that except for this thing we're studying, everything else is the same. When we predict ridership 20 years into the future, resulting from a particular change, the engineers have to make a background assumption that everything else about human nature and human preferences and human priorities is the same. Okay? When I'm talking to a group of millennials, I'll put it this way. Kids, you have to understand that when we predict ridership, the fundamental thing that we rely on is our belief that when you're the same age that your parents are now, you will behave exactly the way they do. That's what we're assuming. Because when we make a 20-year ridership assumption, what are we calibrating on? We're calibrating on behavior now. That's your parents' behavior. And we're assuming that you're going to just step into the role of your parents and make exactly the same choices they made. This is a nice way to radicalize millennials, because none of them want to hear this. Things are changing in nonlinear ways, and nonlinearity means predictability is going down. So we have to be able to have conversations that are about outcomes that don't turn into dueling predictions, that don't just turn into this consultant predicted this ridership, but it turned out to be that. Who cares? Here's what we care about. First of all, it's interesting that abundance of access is already inside of ridership models. We actually already calculate this in the course of predicting the value, of predicting ridership. But in addition, access has its own transhistorical value. Access is part of liberty, and people care about liberty. And we can have a conversation about liberty and opportunity that helps to sell and justify transit improvements without getting into the conversation about ridership predictions. Or at least we can make that conversation about prediction less important. Because the problem of the conversation about prediction is it inevitably becomes an argument between specialists that everyone else tunes out to. We really don't care, but we do care about liberty. The important thing to remember is that abundance of access is a fact. Your liberty and opportunity as mapped by these isochrones is a mathematical fact about a network proposal. Ridership is a prediction, and a prediction is a guess. It may be an educated guess, but it's a guess. So we have such a higher level of confidence when we're talking about access or liberty outcomes than when we're talking about ridership predictions. Now, there's some math to this. And I'm not going to go very far into the math, but just to say, there's some math to how you create the greatest possible liberty through the design and deployment of those 6 variables. And it is less about technology than most folks think. There are lots of wonderful reasons to build rail, but speed and reliability are not among them. Buses and trains can go more or less the same speed in an urban setting, and reliability in an urban setting is mostly about what gets in your way, which is also not specifically a bus rail issue. Now, one of the things I'm almost sure of is that if you're an American, and especially if you're coming from a town where most people drive cars, you're underestimating the value of frequency. However important you think frequency is, it's a little more important than that. And some of the reason for that was clear in that video I showed you, where you saw how events become things by virtue of being concentrated and going back and forth on the same path, so that the line starts to, so that a bunch of dots starts to turn into something you recognize as a stable thing. Frequency is also one of the easiest way to provide connections, the easiest way to make it sure that this line, when it crosses that line, you can actually turn as a passenger. It's because those lines are both coming soon. But motorists have nothing in their daily experience that is an analog to frequency. And I think this is why when you read conversations about transit that are pitched to motorists, you hear all this discussion of in-vehicle travel time and no discussion of frequency. I was just in Reykjavik, Iceland, the capital of Iceland, doing a piece of consulting work for them. And they have big, fancy business consultants who periodically blow through and say things like, you know, you won't get business travelers unless your downtown is 20 minutes by rail from the airport. And there are a whole bunch of problems with that, including the fact that Reykjavik's airport is 40 miles from the city, and you're unlikely to traverse that in 20 minutes. It's the whole lack of context, the notion that nobody would ever go to Iceland because they want to be in Iceland if, getting to the city takes however long it takes. But the other interesting thing is that when you hear those business people talking, you'll hear that travel time, but you won't hear a frequency, right? So are you going to wait 2 hours for it to go to make this trip in 20 minutes, or 15 minutes, or 10 minutes, or all day? It really matters. The frequency really matters, but motorists don't know to ask for it, because motorists are used to the idea that travel time starts when you get into the vehicle. In transit, travel time does not start when you get into the vehicle. Travel time starts when you want to go. And that's a fundamental difference that we always have to keep explaining. And I've just grown used to the fact that I'm going to spend my whole career hitting people over the head about frequency because motorists don't get it. The best metaphor I've been able to come up with, if you live in a suburban house and you have a driveway, is imagine there's a gate at the end of your driveway that only opens once an hour. And think about how, if that were your situation, your desire to have the freeway move faster would suddenly become less important than your desire to get this gate to open more often. And now, finally, my motorist friends, you're ready to understand frequency, and you're ready to understand why frequency trumps travel time in so many times when we're talking about urban transit. And it's, by the way, a major issue here in New Orleans, where you don't have a single bus route that we would consider high frequency all day. You do have some streetcars that are frequent, but not buses. And that's, of course, a long story about the recovery from what you used to have, from restoring what you used to have. So frequency is so hard to explain and yet so critical that one of my major recommendations to transit agencies is that you have to scream about it on your maps. You have to make it really jump out in mapping. And certainly when you're presenting any sort of proposal, you've got to show the frequency, because otherwise all people will see is where the routes go and they won't understand it. They won't understand what's actually being proposed. So a lot of this is happening now, and I've been an evangelist of this for about 15 years, encouraging transit agencies to draw clearer maps where frequency just jumps right out at you. And if you're in the back of the room, you can still see where the frequent lines are in Spokane because of the way they jump out. Basic things, but it's taken that kind of effort. My own slogan about this, frequency is freedom, because when you run the math on how we give ourselves the largest possible isochrones of liberty, it turns out that frequency is often an overwhelmingly important variable. And again, it's the one that motorists are most likely to be ignoring. Vancouver, one of the leaders in this area, has really, is probably one of the most advanced cities in terms of organizing its development vision, organizing its land use planning around frequency and not just around rail, because they don't have enough rail. They have to do high-density, effective development in more places than they have rail. And so the frequent bus network has become a very important additional layer. And in any transit station in Vancouver, you'll see a map that shows you the entire frequent transit network. Think about what that map is saying. That map is saying if you're somebody who doesn't wait 20 minutes for a bus, this is the network that's useful to you. Well, there are lots of people in that category. There are lots of people who need that kind of timeliness. And so we start advertising to them the network for them. And we get a lot more ridership. But the other thing, of course, was there was a regional planning goal in Vancouver that tied everything to the frequent network. Over half of all population and jobs will be on the frequent network. That was done in two ways, right? The frequent network was expanded to touch more population and jobs, and a lot of stuff got built on the frequent network that brought a larger share of population and jobs to it. It is always both of those. You can't just chase development with transit and expect to get anywhere. The development has to come to you. Finally, I want to emphasize that this concept of the frequent network, and think about what that is. That's your rapid transit network, whatever, if you have one, plus just whatever ordinary bus services are always coming soon. Always coming soon. That's enough. And the clever thing about that frequent bus layer is that it's good enough to confer abundant access, and yet, unlike rail projects, it's abundant enough that it can't possibly drive up housing prices everywhere. So this tends to be the layer at which we achieve dramatic social inclusion, adequate affordability, because we can extend this frequent network beyond our inner city hipster zones where people who work at Burger King can no longer afford to live. We can get it to the places where those people can afford to live. And we can get them where they need to be in the context of a network that expands everybody's liberty. So there's a lot of geometry about this. I want to particularly talk a little bit more about the ridership recipe, which is really the maximizing access recipe, and about how that is similar to, and in some ways a little different from, the kind of values that you'll get coming from other urbanist perspectives. The geometry of high ridership is pretty simple. First of all, if you want high ridership, you have to be allowed to focus abundant service to the places where geometry is favorable. We'll come back to that tension. There's a tension there. But secondly, we know pretty well in our business what the recipe for high ridership is. It's frequency, long span, and good connections. So a particular kind of service offering. And then, yes, speed and reliability too, to the extent that you can do that. But frequency comes first. That kind of service following patterns of built environment with 4 variables: density, walkability, linearity, and proximity. The first 2 you know about. But I use these drawings to help everybody remember that whatever your emotions are about density, the relationship between density and ridership is a geometric fact like pi. There is really no point in arguing with it. Those 2 bus routes have the same cost, right? But the one on the top is going past twice as many homes, going through the lives of twice as many people. Of course, all other things being equal, the ridership will be twice as high. The bang for buck will be twice as high if we have twice as many people. If you think it's lower than that, you have to explain why people at high density are less likely to use transit than people at low density, because that's what you'd be saying. In fact, the relationship tends to be curved the other way. Until you get to the extreme densities of Manhattan and Tokyo, where a lot of trips start turning into pedestrian trips, in the medium range of densities, the sort of 5 to 20 DU an acre where most of America lives, the increase in density actually generates an even steeper than linear increase in demand. This is, by the way, one of the reasons why the politics of regional transit agencies tend to be so difficult. Because if you have a regional transit agency that is dominated by the low-density parts of the region, it's very hard to get them to vote for the intense levels of service that you need only in the densest areas to keep up with that demand. Walkability. Okay, every new urbanist knows what walkability is, and it has lots of different important aesthetic dimensions, but we're after something that's quite quantitative, which is that if your local street network if that's a transit stop, and that is somebody's idea of maximum walking distance, then if your local street network looks like this, then 2/3 of this area can get to that stop in that walking distance. If your local street network looks like this, then 1/3 of that area can get to that stop in that walking distance. This kind of street pattern shrinks the area that can get to transit, which makes, so even if it were the same density, and we've all seen towers in this development pattern, right? Toronto, suburban Houston, okay. At the control for density, this gives us a larger market. It's logical for a transit service agency to run more service here than there. Now, here's the one that's unique to transit. Linearity. Control for development. Those 4 developments are exactly the same in these 2 hypothetical cities. But in the first one, they're all along something that customers will perceive as a reasonably direct path. So that with one line that feels direct for everyone, I can connect any 2 of those points. Remember, my goal in network design is to run the fewest possible lines so that I can afford to run them as frequently as possible. Remember that math. Whenever anybody brags to you about how many lines they have in their transit system, remember they're bragging about complexity. They aren't bragging about quality. Because quality, frequency in particular, arises from running the fewest possible lines so you can afford the greatest possible frequency on them. So we want to do this. But if we're faced with this, if we're faced with everything being set back so that we have to drive into it to get up to the door, we have a line that nobody will ride from here to there, right? Because it's just infuriating. So the extent to which the development form gives us this opportunity instead of that opportunity is pretty critical. Now, by the way, this is also why transit agencies will sometimes fight back when you say, we need this to be a really slow, intimate main street. Because to them, it's equivalent to putting this development back here. What you're doing is making this an obstacle to anyone who's going from here to there. Which is why the relationship between good functional transit streets and intimate main streets is so important to get right. And just saying, well, the transit service will just slow down and be intimate is not necessarily an answer that the transit agency should be comfortable with. Remembering too, faster service is cheaper service because we pay drivers by the hour. Because we pay for transit by the hour, faster service is cheaper service. So when you slow us down, you might as well just be taking money. That's essentially how that looks to a transit agency budget. And finally, of course, proximity. All of the things being equal, we would rather take people short distances than long distances, and when we have long gaps, we have to cover all of the things being equal. That makes us less effective. But that's how you get ridership. And in most of our communities, we have to have a different conversation first about how important ridership is. Because one of the things you'll encounter a lot from our conservative friends, they love to write articles about the average ridership of bus service in America. as though that is somehow evidence of something about bus service in America. In general, in my experience, about half of the bus services in America are trying to maximize their ridership. The other half are doing non-ridership things. They're doing things that you wouldn't do if ridership were your goal. Primarily, they're doing several things. They're providing various kinds of social service access, they're responding to civil rights concerns, and they're also putting a little bit in every municipality so every municipality feels included. All of those are non-ridership goals. And so one of the things I'm always suggesting to transit agencies is that they document which of their services are trying to maximize ridership so that when they run non-ridership services, that's not counted as failure. It's not failure. Those services are not trying to maximize ridership. So here's a simple hypothetical fictional city in which dots are development. So, dots closer together are density. I've got two big streets that are straight. If my task were to maximize ridership, which, by the way, it's not just a fiduciary thing. It's not just because we want lots of money. It's because we want to touch a lot of people's lives. The way we touch the most people's lives is to focus on the people who are in the places where we can succeed. So density, walkability, linearity, proximity, everything's good on those two streets and much less good anywhere else in the city. We'll get the highest ridership by putting all of our service on those two streets to achieve a very high frequency, because frequency is the essence of liberty and opportunity. However, Mrs. Jones here is not going to like that. If this is a municipality that has a seat on the board, their whole municipality is not going to like that. So we have to have a conversation about what we're doing when we don't pursue ridership, which is also perfectly legitimate. It's just different. So another way I could have taken those 18 buses to design a transit network for this city would be this, where I have 10 routes instead of 2, and I have spread my buses out so that each of these buses comes about every 54 minutes. Because I've divided my resource over my limited resource over so many route miles. Now, Mrs. Jones has a bus. The problem is it comes every 54 minutes and it doesn't run on Sunday. And so they have a line on the map, but then the ridership is really low because it's not actually very useful. And that's the trade-off. This is why, by the way, you have to draw frequency. This is why, I used the big, heavy lines in the previous example to emphasize the buses were coming all the time. So this is what we call the ridership coverage trade-off. It's the fact that transit agencies are routinely being given totally schizophrenic direction. On the one hand, they're being told to maximize their ridership, and yet when they do the things that you would do if that's were your goal, they're told, but you abandoned Mrs. Jones. Okay? So we have to have a conversation about how important it is to take care of Mrs. Jones. And it may be very important. There may be a very important civil rights reasons, like this may be the African-American corner of town. Or this may be a municipality whose vote you have to have in order to get something else done. Or there may be a general principle of, doesn't this sound easy? Access for all. When the city of Edmonton hired me to look at their transit policies, the first thing I noticed was that at the very top, they had spent $1 million on a beautiful document called The Way We Move. And two of the key principles were compete with cars and access for all. And they spent $1 million without noticing that those two were contradicting each other. Because the way you compete with cars is to choose your markets and aim at the place where the car is already at the disadvantage, which is the high density areas where all the conditions are favorable for transit. But access for all is an opposite goal. So what I'm always doing with transit agencies and with communities is helping them say, look, these goals are both important. I don't have a view about how you should balance them, but they are geometrically opposites. And so you start thinking about what's at stake in each of them. VMT reduction, competition with cars, all of the green goodies that you expect out of public transit are the result of people riding public transit. They're not the result of public transit just existing. But access for all, lifeline access for everyone, service to every member city, that's why we run coverage services. And sometimes, too, for very legitimate civil rights reasons. Certainly in a place like New Orleans, for example, interesting thing about New Orleans is that African Americans are likely to live at dramatically lower densities than white people. Why? Because they're more likely to live in the areas that were substantially depopulated by the hurricane. And so in that situation, yes, there's an important civil rights reason why there's going to be some coverage service, even though when you're running through the lower Ninth Ward, as it is today with so many missing buildings, it's not going to be the high ridership place to go. Nevertheless, there's an important reason to go there. So it's going to move them in the direction of sustained higher ridership. I'll show it to you in a moment. But to get them to that, I had to lead the board through a conversation that said, look, your ridership, the reason your ridership is so low is that only about 50% of your service is trying to maximize ridership. The rest of it is doing other things, other important things, but non-ridership things. Coverage. You can turn the dial toward higher ridership. This was a no new resources plan. All have to work within the existing budgets. Turn the dial toward higher ridership. You'll get two things. You'll get higher ridership and you'll get lots of people screaming at you because you're changing and sometimes, in some cases, cutting services that small numbers of needy people are used to. And this is the beauty. It's amazing when boards of elected officials or appointees of elected officials in this case, ambitious people, everyone on the Houston board wants to be an elected official. When those kinds of people face the fact that they actually have to make a hard choice, and when the hard choice is presented to them so clearly that they can't really evade it, they can't just send it back to staff, they can't ask for more studies because it's this obvious, that they can turn the dial toward ridership, they will get more ridership, and they will get more screaming, and they get to decide how far they want to turn that dial. This is what elected officials are for. This is what they get to do. And I stay out of their way. I keep them in the presence of the reality because they'll try to run away. They'll try to, can we just do more studies or something? No. This is really obvious. How much more, that would be like crowdsourcing a new value of pi. I mean, you could do it, but it's really pretty obvious. So how do we get to that? What does an effective transit planning process look like? To me, and I'm a little bit of a radical in my business, but because the fundamental barrier to good public transit in America is that most Americans haven't a clue what that would look like. And they're coming from a whole set of motorists' expectations and unexamined motorists' analogies that are confusing them. Most obviously, the tendency to assume that it's infrastructure rather than operations, which is consistent with what roads are, and the tendency to assume that it's about speed rather than frequency, which is also consistent with what roads are. So we have to do a lot of educating. And so one of the cores about how we do this is that when we come into a city like Houston or Indianapolis or any number of places where we worked, Reykjavik, Iceland, the first thing we do is get the key stakeholders. It's not the first thing we do, it's second or third. We get the key stakeholders, the leading people, the sort of 50 people in the city whose consensus, if they could reach it, would be a pretty good indicator that we will have political success in doing something. We get them around tables and we play games. We play service planning games, network design games that make them work together to do actual network design so that they start to understand what the network design problem is. Then they discover some of the key choices that the facts of network design present us with, which are the choices that are mapped on this diagram I gave you. They discover all of those choices. And they discover how certain choices push them toward ridership and other choices push them away, but potentially toward other things that they value. And then they're around in small groups, and then we do a pin-up like a typical charrette. There's a bunch of different maps that different tables drew. There's me facilitating a discussion about them. And what I'm doing in that discussion is helping them focus. Now, what's the contrast between what table 3 drew and what table 6 drew? Oh, that's the ridership coverage trade-off right there. What's the contrast between these two tables? These people are about loops, those people are about straight lines. So when we have the necessary conversation about loops, which begins with this earth-shattering observation: very few people want to travel in circles. Except tourists, the tour is a circular path. But the rest of us who have lives, we need to show up for people, and what we want is a direct path. be suspicious of loops. We have that conversation, but I don't have to set up that conversation because I know always some table will draw a loop and give me the material to have that to have that conversation such that they perceive themselves to be discovering the geometric facts. I'm not lecturing them like I have to lecture you. And in fact, if I'd had 2 hours here instead of 1 hour, we would have played a game. Here, I can't quite do it in 1 hour. And then I always say I want to go to the public with multiple plans. I don't want to go to the public saying, here's the plan, do you like it? Because they won't. But if you go to the public and say, here are contrasting ways we could go, and then there's a staff gagging process here. I have to get the staff all trained to not express their own preferences and to really sit back and trust the public to let this conversation actually happen. So here's the ridership coverage trade-off on the geometry of Indianapolis. Please learn those colors. That means red means frequent service, about every 15 minutes or better. Blue is 30. Green is 60, which is almost the definition of uselessness unless you're just utterly desperate and have lots of time. And we said, okay, if you wanted this network to be about ridership, 90% ridership, 10% coverage, that's what it would look like. We can give you a big, high-frequency inner-city grid, which is really powerful because this is where Indy is happening. This is where Indy is growing denser. This is where all the energy is. But if what you want is to make sure that we haven't abandoned everyone and make sure that we have access for all, we could also have a network that was only 50% ridership, 50% coverage. And it would look like this. Lots of green lines. Ridership would be much lower, but Mrs. Jones, wherever she lives, you could say, well, we haven't abandoned you. And then let the public conversation happen. And of course, what we want is not for them to choose one of these, but for them to recognize, okay, if this is 50% and the other one's 90%, then maybe I'm 80%, or maybe I'm at 70%, or maybe I'm at 60%. See where you come down between them. That's the form of the question that we ask. And people love being presented with choices. People hate being presented with one proposal. So here's what Houston looked like in the same notation where red means service every 15 minutes or better. Service that's always coming soon. This is what the Houston network used to look like. Houston this is basically a logical network for the Houston of 1940. Because there was one downtown, and it was all, and it's the frequent networks all radial to that downtown. None of that existed. Now, Houston, like many cities, not only grows toward the mountains, no matter, have you noticed the rule cities grow toward the mountains no matter how far away the mountains are? So it's growing toward the Rockies. And on the Gulf side, it's kind of dying. This is where Houston is depopulating. That's where it's growing. Houston's moving west, moving relentlessly westward. So first of all, this network was just obsolete. Obviously, it wasn't about where people were going. But also, of course, Houston was no longer about one downtown. Houston, you look out over Houston, big clumps of skyscrapers, several different nodes all over the city. And also, so much of this system was infrequent. And the cool thing about drawing maps, the essential reason to draw maps this way, is that you now know that when I show you two blue lines crossing each other, that's two half-hourly buses crossing each other, which means you can't really make a connection. You need to, if you're a motorist, I want you to visualize a road going grade separated from another road without an interchange. That's what that actually is. And once you realize these are all actually grade separated from each other without interchanges, you understand that this network, even though it looks nice as lines on the map, is actually pretty darn useless. So here's what it looks like instead. No new resources before, after, before, after, before, after. Why does it look like that? Because I got the Houston board to tell me we want to move from 50% ridership to 75% ridership. We understand that that means we're moving from 50% coverage to 25% coverage. And as a result, what you see as you go back and forth is not just that there are a lot more red lines, a lot more liberty, but also that there are fewer green and blue lines as you go forward, back, forward, back, forward, back. A nice example is right here. Two red lines with a green line in between them. Now already even people who lived right on that green line were ignoring it and walking to the red line if they actually wanted to go somewhere because that's where the bus is actually coming. And so it's gone, right? Lots of revisions to spacing, lots of bus routes disappearing, lots of people unhappy because their bus stop is disappearing. On the front page of the Houston Chronicle on the day of implementation was a photograph of an unhappy-looking man at a bus stop that was about to be omitted. There was a whole photo essay about him which didn't mention that he was 2 blocks from a light rail station and 2 blocks from a frequent bus line. It was just that this poor man is losing his stop, and that's obviously the end of the world. That's what the media does to us all the time. So so you can understand now the amount of work it was required to get the Houston Metro Board to the point where they were ready not just to deal with that kind of media, but to deal with months and months of hearings in which beautiful people stood up with their beautiful families and said, this is destroying our lives. And nobody wanted to, and first of all, usually the impacts on these people are not as bad as they're making it sound, but often the answer is they have to walk further to better service. And they may not like that, but that is the way you build a more effective system, and also a system that can drive development. But they had to go through that process. It was the result of their choice to turn the dial toward ridership. It wasn't my choice. They understood it was the result of their choice. And the negative public feedback was exactly as I had warned them to expect, because it's pretty much the same everywhere, if you choose to do this. Here's a city more on your scale. This is Salem, Oregon, population 100,000. Very confusing and infrequent transit network that they had. Lots of squiggles, lots of difficulty with the street network. Here's what we did to it. Before, after, before, after, before, after. Again, you see some segments being removed so that we can concentrate more on frequent segments, have a more extensive liberty outcome. And if we'd been able to draw those isochrones before and after for people, most people would have seen their isochrone growing, their blob of liberty growing. Even people who were losing their bus stop would see their blob of liberty growing, because the new bus stop that's 3 blocks away is worth walking to because the service is so good there. So I want to say one other, I think, challenging thing for a lot of us in America, which is that a lot of what you're going to hear in your own municipal debate is going to be about how do we make transit that those people will ride instead of these people. We have in the transit business 2 of the most unhelpful terms in the transit business that appear in a lot of technical work and which I just refuse to use, are this idea that our audience, our potential riders, are somehow divided into someone called a choice rider and then someone else called a dependent rider, a transit dependent. And I will warn you, when transportation experts get together and they think that nobody else is listening, they use an even worse word. They call these people captives. Captives like we have them in the dungeon. And understand what that does. That is a way of flattering ourselves to say, well, we should spend all our money taking care of this person because this person, they're stuck with us anyway. Why should we improve this person's experience? Here's what's wrong with that. The point is, it's not just ethically wrong or wrong from a civil rights perspective, it's actually geometrically and mathematically wrong. It comes from business too, and I want you to notice, those of you who are coming from a business perspective, and I know everyone in this room listens to your business community. Look what business does. Business starts with market segmentation. Business divides the world into our potential customers and not our potential customers. And be careful, because when that understandable impulse of business comes into the public sector, you're on a slippery slope toward a civil rights problem. Because it's not okay for the public sector to say that in the same way. It's not okay for the public sector to say, well, those folks, they're not our focus. But again, the real point about this is that it's not a binary choice. Remember the metaphor of the ladder of opportunity? The metaphor of the ladder of opportunity, the point of that metaphor was to make visible a spectrum of possibilities between poverty and wealth, and to make people believe that they could move along that spectrum, right? When the ladder disappears and is replaced by a wall, you have class warfare, right? We have to keep the ladder visible. It turns out that the ladder, the spectrum, the fact that we're all actually somewhere in the middle with some mixture of financial situations and tastes and preferences that give each of us a slightly different motivation to choose transit. It's because of this that every time we make some small incremental change in transit service, we get a ridership payoff from that, or a ridership loss if we make it worse. If everybody were in boxes, all choice riders or all captive riders, that model doesn't explain the data. Because the data is we can make small improvements and get small benefits. And what that must mean is that people are everywhere along the spectrum, so that when we improve a frequency from 20 to 15, that takes a few people who are on this side of the line over to that side of the line, and they appear as riders. So I got to emphasize that impulse to divide the market, which is just completely natural from a businessman's standpoint, isn't actually how transit succeeds. Transit succeeds by maximizing the diversity of people, and it succeeds by being able to grow incrementally, not just with big bang things like giant sexy projects addressed particularly to so-called choice riders. Telling your planners to separate people demographically, and I have been told this. I have been told by business leaders that we want a bus rapid transit line here, but you can run another bus in traffic next to it for the poor people. We don't want them to be able to get on this. I've been told that. The effect of that mathematically is to make everybody's liberty smaller, including the rich people's liberty. It just doesn't work. The way transit succeeds, if you visualize the most productive transit service you've probably ridden, which is probably a subway in New York or Europe or Asia, you will notice the diversity of people. You will notice the billionaire banker sitting next to the guy who washes dishes in his favorite restaurant, and that's how you know transit's succeeding. It is that diversity that we're always looking for. So what I want to suggest when you're having conversations about people who are striking you as perhaps not worthy of investment, that the right metaphor for approaching them is to think of them as early adopters, or an even better word is pioneers. What these people are literally doing is doing something that you wouldn't be willing to do. And in the course of doing that, they're building something and supporting something that can grow to a point where it is useful to you. And that is exactly what pioneers did, right? Lewis and Clark, in Oregon, where I live, we understand that Lewis and Clark walked across the West so that the early pioneers could take wagon trains across the West so that we would have roads and airplanes to get across the West, and that we are entirely dependent on their leadership. The fact that they created and supported and began the creation of that road by being willing to do something that we wouldn't be willing to do. That's leadership. That's pioneering. And so I want to end by cultivating and encouraging a sense of gratitude. When you're driving down a street and you see somebody waiting at a bus stop that you wouldn't be willing to wait at, understand that they are helping build a transit and sustain a transit system that is ready for you to grow anytime you want. And if they weren't doing that, it wouldn't be there. So finally, an effective transit plan is bringing people together in the presence of geometry and helping people relax into the fact that there are some facts about space and time and distance and cost that are just not going to change. Engage stakeholders in playing with the problem, engage the whole public through contrasting alternatives that excite debate, and then thus fostering stakeholders and key publics who understand the process and therefore maintain the support for change. Thank you very much. So those are some of the things. I'm interested in this notion of what if we had federal grants to just update every bus in a city? Change that story overnight. What would that do? I don't know.
And circulators?
Circulators.
Because you were against loops, and I was wondering. Right.
The circulators are often a solution to a linearity problem, but they're not a very good solution. Because although, and there's this tricky thing about transferring. Nobody actually wants to transfer. If you say that nobody will ever transfer, you make rational network design impossible, because then I would have to run a direct service from everywhere to everywhere else. I'd have 500 lines, and so they'd all come every 2 hours. That's how the math works. So I got to require transferring, but I still got to minimize it too. And so, but remember, because there is that aversion to transferring, longer lines tend to be stronger than shorter ones. And there's a basic problem with the very short line, the downtown circulator, and this is the problem too. It's not just that it's short and therefore it doesn't go many places and therefore not many people get on it. It's also that your expectation for frequency is related to your trip length. If you're going just to the other end of the French Quarter, and you're not a tourist, you got a meeting over there, you want to go kind of now. But, and if you're here, you might wait a couple of hours for a flight to Houston, but you'd be willing to wait a day for a flight to London. The distance we're going determines the waiting time that's tolerable. And the challenge about those very short lines that the downtown business community tends to design, if you let them just go off and design their own line, is that it's almost impossible to run it frequently enough to actually be time competitive. We experienced this at CNU in Dallas, Andres. There was this cute little bus that kept going past and nobody was on it. It was adorable and it was empty all the time. And many of us remember it, and it wasn't frequent enough to be worth waiting for because it was going such a short distance.
All right. Okay. I've got you, Michael. You want a quick question? Okay, we have 2 quick questions, and then we're going to take a break.
Tesla Motors has been building self-driving automation. I'm sorry. Tesla Motors has been building self-driving automation into their cars for years. This week they turned on autopilot. I think the self-driving car, either as an extension of a transit system in smaller units, is part of your future. It seems like it creates a more linear system for the larger, well, in some ways creates a more larger linear system for your mass transit. Are self-driving cars a facilitator of public transit in the future, or is it the death of public transit?
If it could be manipulated to be the death of public transit if Americans want that. And that, in turn, will be a disaster for our cities. Because the defining feature of a big city is the shortage of space per person. Density is what cities are. And the less space there is per person, the less room there is for every person to have a wall between them and everyone else who's traveling. And that's fundamentally the difference between the car and public transit in any sense. Now, there are lots of ways to use that technology in a way that still respects and assigns the proper value to transit's extremely efficient use of space. But there's a danger, which is that if the conversation about, and you've mentioned one of them, which is self-driving taxis will be a great replacement for coverage services, right, which are a very expensive and awkward thing for transit to provide. The other thing, of course, is that Europeans are working on the self-driving bus, which is an easier problem than the self-driving car because it just goes up and down arterials. It is so much simpler a problem. The fact that that's the Europeans who are working on it is just evidence of how little we care in this country. But we are going to have that technology. And remember, once the bus is self-driving, and I know there are reasons to be, we haven't even begun to talk about what's involved in prying Americans' hands off their steering wheels yet. I mean, we haven't begun that conversation. It's going to be something like the conversation about guns, I think. And so a self-driving bus may sound terrifying, but again, human beings are terrible drivers. And the self-driving bus will also be more reliable than even a bus driven by a professional. And that breaks the cost of the iron boundaries of labor cost that are why our transit systems are so poor. Why our transit systems are so low. Remember, it's overwhelmingly the cost of labor. And if you win that battle, you can have a bus coming every 5 minutes everywhere, and that changes the same dynamic in transit's favor. So those are just some of the things. We can have a long conversation about that, but it could go several ways.
Okay, we got Pat, one question.
Okay.
You can hold on now. We have 2 minutes.
How many transit systems use GPS to track and log where riders get on and get off?
Well, they all should be now. I've been told that RTA doesn't quite have that down yet, but by and large, big transit systems all do. It's really, you've got to be able to keep track of that, yeah.